technically on verse 6. Is anybody going to mind terribly if we just start at the top of chapter 17 and read the first 6 all as once? I guess we're over here then, yeah? Cheaters. Okay, let's read just the first 6 verses if you don't mind.
And one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and spoke with me, saying, Come here, I will show you the judgment of the great harlot who sits on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth committed acts of immorality, and those who dwell on the earth were made drunk with the wine of her immorality. And he carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast, full of blasphemous names, having 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was clothed in purple and scarlet, and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls, having in her hand a gold cup full of abominations and of the unclean things of her immorality. And on her forehead a name was written, A Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots, and the abominations of the earth. And I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the witnesses of Jesus. When I saw her, I wondered greatly.
Okay, so there's a theme that we didn't really talk about last week that kind of runs through this. These days, we have a term that we use called a Mickey Finn. Everybody know what a Mickey is? He slipped her a Mickey, or she slipped him a Mickey, right? And by that we mean what the next generation calls a roofie. Everybody know what a roofie is? A roofie is the date rape drug. And so a roofie is a drug that you slip into somebody's drink and it makes them essentially paralyzed, incapable of fighting back. This description of what this wicked woman has done with the kings of the earth is their version of that. You remember the story in the Old Testament of Lot's daughters getting him drunk? Yes? It's one of the most disgusting stories in the whole Old Testament. But anyway, they slipped their father a Mickey or a roofie and took advantage of him in order to get pregnant. This is a rehearsal of that same concept. The angel is explaining all this, and what John is seeing is a person who tricks people into porneia, is the Greek word, or illicit acts. And so she's getting them drunk and taking advantage of them. And so let's not overlook that, that what the story is telling is not of a purely consensual experience. This is this wicked woman. This is the evil woman. And she's plying these people with intoxicating substances so that she can pollute them. And that's what the story is telling. And that's why we have this whole cup full of abominations, and she made them drunk with the wine of her immorality, and all of this is a story of disabling people's wits and taking them to a place that they wouldn't go if they had their wits. And so that's what it's about. So she has some crimes. We'll see the crimes are all kind of listed. Seduction is one of her crimes. Oppressive despotism is another one. Sitting on many waters means that she was oppressing the people of the earth. Contributing to human delinquency, one commentator said, by making the people of the earth essentially drunk and then accomplices to her activities. Drunkenness, being drunk on the blood of the saints, and murder and attempted murder by attempting to murder essentially God's bride, the other woman. And so that's what this story is telling. So let's read chapter 17, verse 7 and 7, 8, and 9. 7, 8, 9.
And the angel said to me, "Why do you wonder? I will tell you the mystery of the woman and of the beast that carries her, which has the 7 heads and the 10 horns. The beast that you saw was and is not, and is about to come up out of the abyss and go to destruction. And those who dwell on the earth, whose name has not been written in the book of the foundation of the world, will wonder when they saw the beast, that it was and is not and will come. Here is the mind which has wisdom, the 7 heads and the 7 mountains on which the woman sits. And there were 7 kings. 5 have fallen, 1 is, the other has not yet come, and when he comes, he must remain a little while."
Okay, so here we're getting, why are we reading this? And the answer is that here is the angel giving John the identifying markers to figure out who this is that's being revealed here symbolically. And fortunately, we have with us Dr. Smith, who actually has studied this and is an expert on it. There are various interpretations that have happened here, and our Bible commentary tells about a couple of different, 3 of them. So one of the questions we have to ask is, when this is revealed, is it being revealed vis-a-vis John's moment in history when he actually had this vision? And we know that this is a vision. He said he was taken away in spirit, right? So that's John's vision. Is it vis-a-vis that time, 5 kings have come and all that? Is it at a time that's relevant to us, long about 1844 to now? And if it is, the only way to get there is by saying a lot of that other stuff kind of chronologically led us to here, the plagues and all that led us up to here, and that's where we are, kind of on the cusp. Or is it during the, what should we call it, the 1,000 years? Because he's not, but he will be, right? So it could be during the millennium. And so these are kind of different interpretations that you have to look at it. If it's in John's time, we're talking about those 5 kings that were described before John's time by Daniel. Same kind of litany of rulers. And then there were a couple more yet to come. If it's relevant to our time, then it's at the time of the great outcry, the great cry, the last day message. And if it's in the future yet, then it's the millennium. What do you think, Dr. Smith?
Well, I think the clue here is actually verse 2.
Which says?
This is actually repeated the second angel's message.
Yes, it is.
Also Revelation 18:3.
Yeah, we're going to get to that. Hopefully tonight. Yeah, yes.
So in Revelation, Ellen White says in Great Controversy 389 that the second angel's message was first preached in the summer of 1844. But it did not reach its complete fulfillment. And then you go to page 390, paragraph 0, she says that the complete fulfillment, or the perfect fulfillment, Revelation 14:8 is yet future. That future to 1911. So now then, this is now in past tense, but present tense was in 14:8. So now some action is taking place. Same thing with 18:3.
Okay.
So now you're in past tense, but yet the present tense was in 14:8.
So, unveil it for us.
Okay. So if you go to Revelation 13, there's 3 phases of the leper-like sea beast. The period of supremacy.
Right.
Controversy, page, I think it's page 3. Actually, it's 439, where she says that it's 538, 17, that period of supremacy. So John sees this beast coming up out of the sea. Verse 3 then says it received a deadly wound.
Right.
And the same text, very next statement is wound was healed.
Right.
So it doesn't tell you how long. But when you go to 13:12, it's United States after the wound is healed.
Right.
Verse 12. So that puts it in stage 3, or the phase 3.
So, the spirit of prophecy has not said exactly dogmatically what we should believe on this. So we're actually in a position where we can interpret this, as long as we don't leave the reservation, as you choose. There's one comment I thought that was interesting from the commentary. It says, in view of the fact that inspiration has not indicated whether the 7 heads are to be understood as representing the 7 particular nations, and is not specified at any point of time from which they are to be reckoned, evidence is insufficient to warrant a dogmatic identification of them. I like that line. And that means that, we're keeping an open mind. We'll keep our eyes open, and we see what happens. It may yet be that we're in the middle of that. It may be that most of that has already taken place, and it may be that there's a good bit yet to come. So, yes, over there.
Beast, where's that say that? I just saw it. Will come from the pit. Where's that?
Yes, will come from the abyss.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that could be future.
Well, and I think whenever I see abyss, I think of the 1,000 years. Because that's when it's talking about him being chained in the abyss. And that Greek word abyssus actually has another meaning, which frequently in Greek meant the grave. But that isn't problematic, because the grave is the abyss, and that he be locked in it's essentially a nothingness time. So I don't have a real problem with that. But that's, unfortunately, a lot of evangelicals look at that being abyss, being death, being in the grave. And so they're looking for a real Antichrist that would be resurrected, a real literal human person Antichrist. And, I don't think that we really see ever in prophecy a lot of prophecy about wicked individuals. It's really about systems and governments and world events more than it is about, and then, there's going to come this guy, and his name's going to be Fred, and he's going to be real bad. I just don't see that very much in the Old Testament. It's really about kingdoms and stuff that affects everybody in a more global way. So let's read 11 and 12.
The beast which was and is not is himself also an 8th, and is one of the 7, and he goes to destruction. The 10 horns which you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received a kingdom, but they receive authority as kings with the beast for 1 hour.
So he's talking about the 7, and the 7 is really interesting because the 7 are 7 mountains. Now, mountains in Bible usually indicate kingdoms, but at the same time, there's clearly a strong, immediate message from John to the people that were alive right then about Rome. And Rome was called the city of 7 hills. Everybody knew that about Rome. It's like saying things are happening in D.C. Well, what is D.C.? The seat of American government, right? I mean, we know when we say D.C., we are talking about the seat of American government. And if anybody said something about, well, you got to take that to the 7 hills, they know they were talking about Rome. And so here is this woman who sits on 7 hills or mountains. And so it's very clear to all of John's original audience that they were talking about Rome. And we believe we're still talking about Rome. We're still talking about Rome as a power that unites all these others. And of course, all these others have shifted from time to time from other governments, the Goths and all that sort of thing, to, at this point, apostate religion. Because really we are talking at this point about a unifying, and dare I say it, a one world government. That's really what we're talking about. Because none of the prophecies of persecution that trigger this end time description really make sense on local geographic levels. it really has to come down to a one world. I'm not a big fan of the word decree, but Sister White uses it, so let's go with it. A one world government decree. Have you ever thought about what it would take for the world to all agree? Yeah, I understand that, but what I'm talking about is, what would it take for the whole world to be unified in making a law? Socialism is part of it. This whole globalist thing, and it just seems to me, as I try to imagine what that would look like, and I'll tell you, when we attach it to the Sunday law, it's much harder to see now than it was in the 1950s and 60s when we had blue laws all over this country. It was much easier to think about that back then. How do you think about it now in the kind of post-New Age, post-religion kind of experience? How do you think about it? And the answer is that when war and strife has really caused every sort of decimation that we don't even want to think about or imagine, it is very possible for a charismatic religious leader like the Pope. I believe that all it would take is a major alliance between the Pope, the leaders of Islam, and the leaders of Hinduism. And there would be a strong pull for the whole world to get in line. Because the Pope is generally perceived as a benign individual. As soon as he gets through with the molestation problem, he's a benign individual. He's not out there to hurt anybody. And as John would say, listen to the words he's been saying. He has been saying justice warrior stuff for the last couple of years. Now, there are people who have come out on the record and said, this is the last pope, this is the one, we finally have the Jesuit, you know, all this kind of thing. Boy, I'm not gonna put my neck out and embarrass myself on that. The fact is, imagine if, y'all remember John Paul. That guy had some charisma, right? That guy, we all went, man, there's a pope that he's attractive and appealing, and I mean, they're all 150 years old, but he was, for a pope, I mean, he was something. And I'm just telling you that we've got an old Jesuit now, and he may have all kinds of stuff, but they could definitely, at some point in the future, fill that role with a charismatic, paternalistic peacemaker. And it would be so easy for the whole world to go, yeah, well, you know, we're atheists, we don't believe in religion, but that guy, he's got it going on. And if that happened, a unification between Islam and Hindu, I think many governments would say, dude, this is the answer to all of our strife. This is the way to end warfare as we've known it. You know, terrorism goes away. Everybody gets recognized and respected for who they are. And all we have to do is follow this leader, because he's a great leader. Who knows? It may be a she-pope by then. All we have to do is follow this leader. She's fantastic, right? And I just see, and you may think me crazy, but I just see that it could happen. I don't think it's this guy. Just let me tell you, I think, this guy's looks to me like he's got one foot on a banana peel. I don't want to say anything ugly, but he's old, you know. But boy, I could picture them picking one. And you can make him a Jesuit if you want. I don't think he needs to be a Jesuit. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. And all the Pope needs to have absolute power is charisma. And they've been lacking charisma for 3 or 4. John Paul was the last one that had any hint of charisma. And again, John Paul, you know, when they wear all that white, it's hard even to reveal any charisma. So for John Paul to shine a little through that, you wait, have a pope show up in blue jeans. I'm not teasing. When a pope shows up and looks like that Chandler preacher or one of those people that has a big following, he can make a difference. And he can make a difference that would be felt around the world. And don't think that it couldn't happen, because I know there are a lot of people, especially former Adventists, who say, look, all that stuff is just a dream. None of that ever is going to happen. You can't buy that. Everything has changed. Religion is dead, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I am telling you, it's going to happen. Now, I can't tell you exactly how it's going to happen, so don't quote me and say, Pastor Jamie said as soon as the Pope wears blue jeans. Go ahead.
What if Satan would personate himself as Jesus Christ through the Pope?
That's right.
Also, Ellen White says in Great Controversy, page 50, that Satan created the papacy as a monument for himself, so he could seat himself upon the throne,
right,
to rule the earth according to his will.
Right.
So it looks to me like that, my personal feeling is that he will come in the person of the Pope. And so that could answer the question
that's
right there.
Extremely possible. And again, there's this quote that chatters around my head a little bit. It's from a little poem I like, and it says, the devil came in the form of a snake, and in 16 words persuaded people who had all the fruit in the earth to eat that they were desperately hungry and needed one more. Something like that. And if Satan was slick enough that he could persuade Eve that she needed to eat the one fruit that God told her not to eat, I'm telling you, with the education of the current young generation, I don't want to put anybody down, it's not going to be hard to hornswoggle them. If they think Bernie Sanders has the answers, this is easy. I'm telling you, that is not a joke. If these people think, if these people, the college students of today, who absolutely have become opulent on the capitalist system, think that socialism is the answer, government-enforced socialism is the answer, how hard would it be for us to sell them a Sunday law? Goodness, it's easy. You just have to listen to the arguments that they're falling for and go, wait a minute. Has nobody asked who's going to pay for this? Has nobody asked? I mean, I would love to have all health care be free. But there is no such thing. I mean, unless you're going to make slavery back and make all the doctors slaves, right?
Go to Cuba.
Slavery is the only way to make anything free. So I don't know. How are you going to pay for it? Okay. At the end of verse 12, it says, but they receive authority as kings with the beast for 1 hour has caused untold reams of problems. Some people want to take the hour and say, well, what is an hour vis-a-vis prophetic day? And so it would be about 2 weeks in a prophetic year, and on and on. And other people have just said, well, no, it's a literal hour. It's all going to be over in an hour. And I think either of those are possibilities. But we also have to recognize that in Greek, the word an hour also can mean right at this time, right at that time. And it could be something from instant all the way to at that time. So from Greek, it's too much, as I read that earlier thing, it's too much for us to be able to say, oh, it's 2 weeks. We can't be certain of that. So really, it means a particular time, and you have to look at the context. And if I read this context as I'm reading through it, it looks like it says at that time more than it says an exact hour. But I have no problem with people who disagree with me on any of this because it's open, right? And we will see. So those are my prophetic words. Quote me on that. We will see. And we may see sooner and we may see later, but we'll see. And those of us who pass and miss it, we will see. Okay? We will have reruns on this because we will all know how it ended. It's not going to be a mystery to those of us who pass before it happens. We will see. So you may quote me on that one. Let's read 13 through... Oh, shall we go all the way to 18? All right, 13 through 18.
These have one purpose, and they give their power and authority to the beast. These will wage war against the Lamb, and the Lamb will overcome them, because he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and those who are with him are the called and chosen and faithful. And he said to me, the waters which you saw where the harlot sits are peoples and multitudes and nations and tongues. And the 10 horns which you saw, and the beast, these will hate the harlot and will make her desolate and naked, and will eat her flesh and will burn her up with fire. For God has put it in their hearts to execute his purpose by having a common purpose, and by giving their kingdom to the beast until the words of God will be fulfilled. The woman whom you saw is the great city, which reigns over the kings of the earth.
Okay, so starting with 18, it says, he's clearly identifying Rome there. If you listen to what he's saying to his original audience, the woman who you saw is the great city which present tense reigns over the kings of the earth. That's got to be Rome. Now we go back to 13. It says they have one mind. They're of one mind is what the Greek kind of lists. And they give their power and authority. These are these 7 and 10. He's just mentioned 10. And then he gives us a time marker in verse 14. And the time marker is they will wage war against the Lamb, and the Lamb will overcome them. And that has to be, and I don't know, what is the right term for the third coming? I don't know, is that the right word for it? The post-millennial coming?
Be the second part of the Armageddon.
Yes, the Armageddon, right. It would be Armageddon. So for me, there's, I have problems with religious people historically have called the first coming what's the word that most churches use for that? The incarnation. And then we always trumpet the second coming. And I understand why we do it. It's a convenience. It isn't the second coming. You read the Old Testament, he'd made several visits, several stops here in the Old Testament. So the incarnation, I get that means he came as a child, and so that's special. The second coming, okay. The second coming after the incarnation, well, unless you count the post-resurrection visits. But anyway, so the second coming, I get that. So then he takes his people, and there's 1,000 years in which Satan has nobody to torment, nobody to mess with. So what do you call the next return? The third coming, it just sounds weird, doesn't it? What's that? The final return, the return of New Jerusalem, the Armageddon. I think Armageddon is the right description of that.
But there's 2 battles. You got the battle at the second coming.
Yes.
You finish up the battle at the third.
After the 1,000 years. Okay, so we can call it the final Armageddon. How's that? The final Armageddon. So, and then he's talking around this time frame that God has put it in their hearts to execute his purpose by them having a common purpose. This is where we get this sense of a universal decree, right? And that universal decree is exactly what we are looking at and talking about when we, unfortunately, because there's been so much time between the time that Sister White described it and now, a lot of people have just given up on it. And if you think, because you live in a place where we talk about this stuff frequently, that I'm not, I mean, you guys need to check your friends, because your friends from 30 and 40 years ago who don't attend anymore, one of the reasons a lot of them don't attend anymore is because they've given up waiting. They said, you know, and the Bible predicts this, remember? It says, people are going to say, oh, things have gone on as they always went on, and people are just doing what they've always done, and it's never going to happen. You know, it's weird, because my only insurance against thinking that way is the resurrection of Jesus. Have you ever thought about that? From Abraham to Jesus, you could say the same thing. Oh, things happen. People come, people go. It's all the same. Nothing ever changes. And from Jesus' ascension until now, you could say the same thing. Oh, everything's going on the way it always gone on. It's people doing the same old stuff. It's all the same. But the resurrection of Jesus is the one thing that declares the supernatural is engaged and is going to be engaged again, because he ties his promise of a second coming to the resurrection. In like manner, as you have seen him go, he will return. And you know, it's weird. I've just gotten through reading again the Strobel book. What's it called? Case for Christ. How many of you have read the book? It's a very, very good book. And he gets to that. He says, you know, the resurrection, if you look at the literature, you look at the history, you look at the science, you look at everything, it happened. And one of the more persuasive arguments that he always makes, and it's really one that I'd never really gotten all that enchanted with, because, you know, I always see these Muslims doing truly horrendous things that are going to result in their death, suicide bombings and things like that. Those guys are true believers. I mean, they believe in something. But I consider it a really misguided belief, because I don't think there's any win to doing that, right? But they're true believers. And so the argument, what's that?
So were the Jews in Christ's day.
Right. And so that's exactly where I'm getting. So the question is martyrdom proof? But wait, here's where it gets twisty. And if you've read the book, you know. Here's where it gets twisty. No, martyrdom isn't a proof, because Jim Jones's people all drank the Kool-Aid, right? But they believed because Jim Jones told them what to believe, and they believed it. Islamists believe because they're seeking an identity in Islam, and they believe it because they want to believe it. The first dozen or so martyrs, maybe the first 50 or 200 martyrs, all knew whether Jesus had been resurrected or not. Now, people can believe something and die for it. I get that. But people who knew that the resurrection of Jesus was a hoax would never die for it. Certainly not in those numbers. You get what I'm getting at, right? If you knew that you'd made up this story about Jesus being resurrected and really he was dead and all that sort of thing, but we made it up because we wanted to continue the movement because we were having a good time with it, you'd never die for that. The people who were the first martyrs saw Jesus resurrected. They died because they knew it was true. And to me, that just screams reliability, along with all the other stuff, you know. That resurrection is so important in this, because otherwise we will be very tempted to think the miraculous is gone. It's done. We haven't seen it in a while. We haven't seen anybody resurrected. We haven't seen a whole lot of speaking in tongues. We haven't seen a whole lot of people walking in their shadow, casting on somebody and them being healed. People setting handkerchiefs that Paul touched. We haven't seen a lot of that. Now, do we see miracles? I've seen miracles. I've seen unmistakable miracles. But God is doing miracles in this culture in a way different way. Have you all read all these stories about what's happening in the Middle East? In the Muslim countries? So many Muslims are having dreams and visions about Jesus. And that's where a lot of the few converts that we have over there are coming from. They have these dreams about Jesus, and Jesus speaks to them. And you've read the stories, haven't you? And I'm thinking, God works with different cultures in different ways. All those miracle stories of missionaries we heard growing up, true stories. We knew those missionaries, right? These weren't strangers who wrote things in books to create hoaxes. These were people we knew. My father-in-law, others. It is so tempting to say, well, it's going to go on as it always gone on, until you recognize Jesus really did rise from the dead, and the people who saw him and knew it died for it. And in like manner, as you saw him go, he is coming again. Now, all of this stuff is telling us some things that are going to happen around that time. And you better believe that it's going to happen. And if you think that it's not going to happen because of some big decree, okay, you're going to have to throw out all of Ellen White. You can do that, but you can't throw away Revelation. It's right here. And it tells the exact same story. Here it says that all of these subjects of the woman, shall we call them subjects? Kings under the woman. I mean, that's the picture we've gotten, is the woman is sitting on these 7 mountains and she's got these 10 kings, right? These subject kings, are going to get their heads all together and they're going to put one single plan into motion. Does this sound like a one world government to you? Sure does to me. And if we see them instead of governments as world religions, apostate religions, it looks the same way. Right? I mean, if we're going to look at apostate religions, I'd certainly call atheism an apostate religion, wouldn't you? You have to have a lot of faith to be an atheist. I mean, you have to deny a lot of people who are telling you, my life has been changed, God has come into my life and made a difference for me, and they're going, yeah, something happened, but it wasn't God. You have to believe that up front or you can't be an atheist. And on and on. So here there are all these either nations or apostate religions, or combination thereof, are pulling together, and it says they are one mind. They've decided they're going to act in concert under the strong drink of the woman. That's the story the Great Controversy tells, isn't it? She tells it in a little bit more detail, but it's the same story. Okay, so let's read 18:1 through 4. 3, 1 through 3.
After these things I saw another angel coming down from heaven, having great authority, and the earth was illumined with his glory. And he cried out with a mighty voice, saying, Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has become a dwelling place of demons, and a prison of every unclean spirit, and a prison of every unclean and hateful bird. For all the nations have drunk of the wine of the passion of her immorality, and the kings of the earth have committed acts of immorality with her, and the merchants of the earth have become rich by the wealth of her sensuality.
Good. Okay, so if verse 4 that we're about to read didn't reprise the third angel's message, I would say that sounds a lot like the 1,000 years. Doesn't it? That sounds like all the evil are in the abyss. It's become a prison of every unclean spirit and every unclean and hateful bird. Doesn't that sound like the millennium to you? It does to me. But it can't be, because verse 4 follows on. So let somebody read just verse 4 and 5.
I heard another voice from heaven saying, "Come out of her, my people, so that you will not participate in her sins and receive of her plagues. For her sins have piled up as high as heaven, and God has remembered her iniquities."
All right, now let's look at that whole set and say, what does that mean? We think that the nations drinking the wine of her passion for immorality is that she's hornswoggled them, she's slipped them a Mickey, and she's got them on her side. Why the merchants? Why are we talking about merchants, Dr. Smith?
This should be basically everyone.
Everyone. The capitalists.
The ones who take and do business with it.
Yes, yes.
That's interesting here in verse 5.
Yeah.
Ellen White says that's the Sunday law.
Right.
She says, when do her sins reach into heaven? And then she gives us the answer, when the nations enforce the Sunday law.
So, and that's an interesting turn of phrase in Greek. Her sins is piled as high as heaven. It sounds a lot like our English idiom, her sins stink to high heaven. Right? The word piled high is a much better translation than what we find in the King James, but her sins are piled high. It actually is a word in Greek that means have been stuck together to make this mountain of sins that you can see from heaven. Babylon was a place where they tried to build a tower to heaven. Get it? So it's a play on words. There's several plays on words coming up in the following few verses. So and here they are. These are beautiful ones. In fact, let's just read chapter 6 or verse 6 all by itself, because it has some fun plays on words here. Go ahead.
Pay her back even as she has paid, and give back to her double according to her deeds. In the cup which she has mixed twice as much for her.
This is almost a poem. So each time he says these couplets, you can see the couplets, right? Each time he says the couplets, he uses the same word. So pay her as she's paid. Double her as she's doubled is what it says. And mix her as she's mixed. And so they're these beautiful little couplets, and he, again, the one we didn't translate as well as we should have, give back double according to her deeds. The word double is there twice in Greek. So double her back what she doubled. And by the way we've translated it, it's not very good, because it looks like she's gonna get twice back for what she did. And that's not what the Greek says. Give her back double for what she's doubled. In other words, she's getting pound for pound what she gave, every bit. And that it's a beautiful little deal. I get maybe more joy out of these word plays than you do. But okay. Let's do 7. And whoever reads 6 can keep reading 7 if you want, but 7 and 8.
To the same degree give her torment and mourning. For she says in her heart, I sit as a queen, and I am not a widow, and will never see mourning. For this reason in one day her plagues will come, pestilence and mourning and famine, and she will be burned up with fire. for the Lord God who judges her is strong.
So we keep seeing these judgments against her. I missed telling you back in verse 16 when it said, the 10 horns of the beast, these will hate her and will make her desolate and naked and will eat her flesh. The word in Greek there says, will eat chunks of her flesh. Isn't that nice? What a picture. And so here we have again, and she's going to get burned up. And it says to the degree she glorified herself. Do you remember the statement when Jesus was saying, look, those of you who have it here, you've already received your reward. Remember that? Those of you who wanted to be recognized on earth and you bragged and you were proud, you got it. Congratulations. What you asked for, you got it. For those of you who want more, you need to let that rest. That's a really broad paraphrase, I recognize. But that was what Jesus was saying. He says, if you're clamoring for the world's attention, go. You get it. But that's all you get. You've got your reward, is what he says, right? He says, but if you want something different, don't do that, and your God, who is in secret, will reward you in secret. Really interesting verse. And here it looks like at the end of 7, she's actually being accused of pride. And one of her punishments is coming because she said, I'm not a widow, I'm a queen. And so because she had the hubris to put herself up and say, I'm the queen, that's one of the reasons for her punishment. And then her punishment, here it comes in verse 8. And it says that she will be burned up with fire. Burned up with fire. That sounds like the final Armageddon again, doesn't it? I mean, it doesn't really happen before then, does it? So this is the final Armageddon. Okay. And then we're going to hear what happened to the kings that were with her. Let's read 9 and 10.
When the kings of the earth who committed adultery with her and shared her luxury see the smoke of her burning, they will weep and mourn over her. Terrified at her torment, they will stand afar off and cry, Woe, woe to you, great city, you mighty city of Babylon. In 1 hour your doom has come.
And that, again, 1 hour is in one, at this moment. At one moment, it can be translated that. It depends on the context. Whether it's going to actually take an hour, whether it's actually going to take 2 weeks, or whether this is a generalized thing that says it's going to happen right all at once. And I favor the all at once, but we'll see. You're quoting me on this one. We will see. Okay? And I'm having a little challenge on this one because that one says, I thought we were describing Armageddon, and now all of a sudden he's saying that these other kings are going to mourn for her. Seems to me that at Armageddon, they're going to be busy. What do you think, Dr. Smith?
In chapter 19, it looks like the papacy in the United States are destroyed in the lake of fire the first time. And then Satan is not destroyed until the second time.
Okay. Okay. Very good. Thank you for that. Let's do 11 through 13.
And the merchants of the earth wept and mourned over her, for no one buys their merchandise anymore. Merchandise of gold and silver, precious stones and pearls, fine linen and purple, silk and scarlet, every kind of citron wood, every kind of object of ivory, every kind of object of most precious wood, bronze, iron, and marble, and cinnamon and incense, fragrant oil and frankincense, wine and oil, fine flour and wheat, cattle and sheep, horses and chariots, and bodies and souls of men.
Okay, so people have tried over the years to figure out why this long list of mercantile items, and nobody's come up with a really good answer. It looks to me, as I read it, that what John is trying to describe and what the angel is describing to him is everything that we find fine. And he makes a list of it to make that everything that we find illustrative and real. Everything that we cherish. Now, it says, I think you called it merchandise. The translation that you have in your little printout calls it cargoes because it's kind of moving to a little bit of a nautical theme. And he's moving to a nautical theme, and you'll see why in the next coming verses here. But he's moving to a nautical theme, so that's why this translation, the New American Standard, calls it cargoes. Because as we move to the nautical theme, it's going to be important later. And so he says all of these things, and he ends it with these two really interesting ones that are translated in the NASB as slaves and human lives. That's fascinating. Is this a message against slavery? In a culture that was steeped in slavery, in which slavery was not a big problem? Is this the angel or John giving us some sort of word against slavery? Feels like it to me, but I don't know. Yes?
Keep in mind that a lot of the early Christians are from the lowest classes of society. They might have a very different viewpoint than, say, the people at the heart of the Roman Empire who were very rich and very powerful and don't see anything wrong with slavery.
Yes, and again, all these luxury goods. Because he's describing luxury goods, clearly. He doesn't say, and every kind of 2x4s. He's talking about citron wood. And so that would be wood that would be highly scented that people would use to make their moth-free closets and their fancies, right? And so all of these are definitely luxury goods. So let's read 14 through 17.
The fruit you long for is gone from you, and all things that were luxurious and splendid have passed away from you, and men will no longer find them. The merchants of these things who became rich from her will stand at a distance because of the fear of her torment, weeping and mourning, saying, Woe, woe, the great city, she who is clothed in fine linen and purple and scarlet, and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls. For in 1 hour such great wealth has been laid waste. And every shipmaster and every passenger and sailor, and as many as make their living by the sea, stood at a distance and were crying out, as they saw the smoke of her burning, saying, What city is like the great city?
All right. Why don't you go ahead and read one more?
And they threw dust on their heads and were crying out, weeping and mourning, saying, Woe, woe, the great city, in which all who had ships at sea became rich by her wealth, for in 1 hour she has been laid waste.
So we've seen that her sub-kings, her subservient kings, whether those are actually kingdoms or whether they're actually religions, saw her destruction. And now we see those others, the merchants, people who essentially made their living off of her and her opulence, are now also seeing that her end is bitter and unpleasant. And then we shift voices and we see what happens to the redeemed when they see this happen. So let's reach up to verse 20 through 20 through 20, let's say 3.
Rejoice over her, O heaven. Rejoice, saints and apostles and prophets. God has judged her for the way she treated you. Then a mighty angel picked up a boulder the size of a large millstone and threw it into the sea and said, With such violence the great city of Babylon will be thrown down, never to be found again. The music of the harpists and musicians, flute players and trumpeters will never be heard in you again. No workman of any trade will ever be found in you again. The sound of a millstone will never be heard in you again. The light of a lamp will never shine in you again. The voice of the bridegroom and bride will never be heard in you again. You merchants were the world's great men. By your magic spell, all the nations were led astray.
All right. So, lest you think that this is just a poetic diatribe against her, this is a reflection of the Old Testament. There are several passages in the Old Testament. I'll share one of them with you, but there are several passages in the Old Testament that have exactly the same sorts of predictions for Babylon. Jeremiah 51, verse 60 says, Jeremiah had recorded on a scroll all the terrible disasters that would soon come upon Babylon, all the words written here. He said to Sariah, when you get to Babylon, read aloud everything on this scroll. Then say, Lord, you have said that you will destroy Babylon so that neither people nor animals will remain here. She will lie empty and abandoned forever. When you have finished reading the scroll, tie it to a stone and throw it in the Euphrates River. And then say, in this same way, Babylon and her people will sink, never again to rise, because of the disasters I will bring upon her. Now, what's really interesting is that there were a lot of Jews in Babylon. Come out of her, my people. This is the same message. Nothing is new in Revelation. Not anything in Revelation is particularly new. All of it is a reprise of the promises that God had made in the Old Testament to his people. And this is the second fulfillment of all those prophecies of the Old Testament. So, the last verse, do we have another reader left? Can you read the last verse for us? All right. So, we are at the end of chapter 18, and what we have is, again, this reprise of the Old Testament that is saying that Babylon will be at an end. And all this, it really is very poetic. But all of this poetic stuff is really about saying that this is an end. We're in chapter 18. Remember how many chapters there are in Revelation? 22. We're very, very near the end. And I believe this is where John is really signaling this is what the end is going to be. It's going to be silence out of Babylon. We're not going to hear anything. We're not going to see anything. There's going to be no headlines. There are going to be no harpists. There's not going to be anything to know, because it's going to be as deep in the ocean as if you dropped a great big rock. An industrial-sized millstone is really what that scripture is saying. Yes.
Woman is
so
she's on this beast.
She is a power that apparently rules from Rome, but is in alliance with all the world's rulers, and they're numbered at both 7 and 10. Seven mountains. She's on that, and she's also on the beast. Well, I think we'll hear a little bit more about beast later, but right now she's on 7 mountains and a beast.
In one place there it said something about the beast becoming the 8th.
Yes.
Okay, and then how does that tie to with Babylon? The woman is Babylon? Because it seems like these kings and these people that benefited or carried her,
right,
they turned against her and ate her flesh. And then
yes. And it looks like the eating of the flesh wasn't an angry turning on her so much as it was everything went sideways.
So is that what we consider the Pope in the Catholic Church?
What do you think, Dr. Smith?
Well, I think, because you're talking about the Battle of Armageddon here, beginning like with verse 14. So it looks like that the Satan, which is this beast, will turn against the Catholic Church because they're no longer a benefit for him.
I see.
And so they go down. But it's interesting because when you get to 19, both the United States and the papacy are cast into the lake of fire.
Right, and again, so we can't get too chronological about this because it's clearly doing some quick reprises of different events that try, as scholars may have tried over the years, whether you put it in the past, whether you put it in the present, whether you put it in the future, or all three, there is no way to make this work out chronologically. It cannot work out chronologically. Okay.
Babylon, which is still talking about the woman, but using a different...
Babylon is that power. And I think that is represented by the woman.
And in this...
Go ahead.
Well, in the Fourth Spirit of Prophecy, page 233, Ellen White identifies the woman in Revelation 17 to be the papal power. It's interesting that Sir Isaac Newton did the same thing.
Yes, and Martin Luther did the same thing. No question that as soon as Protestant thought erupted, it became obvious to all the scholars that studied it that that's what it was talking about. There's never been a confusion from Martin Luther forward about what that is until the Scofield Bible came out and carried some Jesuit thought about placing somebody else in that role. Go ahead.
Well, I was just, this is the first time that it kind of dawned on my brain that this papal power, the woman, Babylon, got turned against by all of these powers. And
if you read that, it says, the waters which you saw where the harlot sits are peoples and multitudes and nations and tongues. And the 10 horns which you saw and the beast, these will hate the harlot, I'm in verse 16, and will make her desolate and naked, and will eat, chunks of her flesh, and will burn her up with fire, for God has put in their hearts to execute his purpose by having a common purpose, by giving their kingdom to the beast until the words of God will be fulfilled. And the woman you saw is the great city. So she is Babylon, she is the papacy, and the question is, how does that work out that they all turn on her? And that it isn't the main feature of the story that we generally understand this to be. No. And it could be, as he says, at the first Armageddon, probably, and not the second Armageddon, the pre-millennial Armageddon. And so there's a really interesting reading you can do if you want to Google it up, and it's not terribly hard to find. Oh, we're out of time, aren't we? I'm sorry. Let's pray, and I'll continue that thought. Dear God, thank you for the opportunity to study your word tonight. Please help us to be redeemed by your resurrection. We ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.